vintage 2020 for Sailor Seek's horse. I think we've had easier vintages, really, and easier years managing a vineyard. Spring started off very dry early on and very windy, so the vines were a bit stressed to start with. That wind carried through to flowering where it became wet and windy, not perfect conditions. We ended up with poor fruit set and low yields at 2 tonnes to the hectare. Summer and autumn were mild. We didn't have much sunshine, we didn't have much warmth. It really felt like we missed out on summer this year. It was pretty good weather for powdery mildew, to be honest, so we had to be really diligent in the vineyard to make sure that didn't take hold. We even saw a little bit of botrytis sneak in towards the end of the season, which we've never seen before in our vineyard, so that's just something new for us to note. Harvest was towards the end of April, which is later than we've harvested for the last few years. So back to a longer, cooler kind of a season. We were really just waiting for tannins to come around in the Pinot and the acidity to settle a little bit in the Chardonnay. And when that happened, with low yields and a cool, long ripening period, we had really intense flavours, really delicate flavours, lovely structured wines. Really excited about what we have in barrel. Wish we had a bit more of it if I had anything to complain about, really. I think sometimes we like to dismiss these cooler vintages straight up because they're not as solid, they're not as forward, but for me, I think we often get much more structured wines, more interesting wines, more complex wines, and so I'm really excited about these cooler years sometimes. For us, a standout, I think, are some of our Chardonnay batches. Some of those clones came in just looking great, so seeing those in barrel now is really exciting, and hopefully we can nurse that through to getting into bottle in that way, which would be great. So I think overall, it was a tricky growing season. It was a cooler year. We've got really delicate wines, lovely structured wines, and I think they're going to be delicious. I just wish we had twice as much.
Very well, beautiful weather, low yields, so things are a little bit lighter on in the winery, which meant no shuffling of tanks. Then the old COVID-19 thing struck and we all had to social distance in the vineyard, which made things interesting, but other than that, very good vintage.
How was the weather this season?
Weather this season was particularly dry. The old Coal River Valley lived up to its reputation, and no rainfall for most of the year, so the irrigation ran pretty flat out for the whole year.
How did the fruit end up in the tanks?
Well, that's an interesting question there from Paul, and I think we used the same method as everybody else, and that was a pump and 2 hoses.
What was the biggest challenge this season?
The biggest challenge for sure was the social distancing and trying to make sure the staff were appropriately spaced through the vineyard and not crossing each other in the winery, so yeah.
And what surprised you this year?
Surprised me was quality of fruit. Because of the low yields and the particularly dry season, everything came in absolutely pristine.
Which wine are you looking forward to releasing?
It'll have to be the Bubbles, but yeah, we won't be seeing that one coming through anytime shortly. It'll take at least 3 years.
Overall, the producers on the East Coast were very, very happy with quality. The yields themselves seem to be, from what everyone is saying, the whites were about on average and looking really good, but Pinot seemed to be down 15 and up to 40% across vineyards across the area. Shiraz in particular did seem to suffer with flowering, and it was down up to 80%. So although the yields were down a little bit, everyone is really excited about the quality. And some winemakers are even saying that some of the best Pinot Gris they've seen, others saying some of the best Riesling they've seen. We're really happy here with our Chardonnay. We've just seen really nice high natural acidity, and some, not only the really typical East Coast fruit character, but some nice savoury character as well. So we've had some winter rain this year, and so that's looking really exciting for next year already. But in terms of the 2020 vintage, amazing quality, really looking forward to particularly the reds. It was a little bit slower ripening, but the concentration of flavour and colour and some nice fine tannins is something that we look forward to seeing in not too distant future. Cheers.
This vintage certainly wasn't without its challenges. The obvious one from the outset was harvesting and making wine in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic. This saw us have to adapt and change a lot of what we do to ensure we could create a safe working environment and continue harvesting and winemaking without interruption. This was a compressed vintage for us as well, so once we did finally get to start picking, we really had to pick up that pace quickly to ensure we could get everything into the winery in time. It's the case every year, but certainly on a later year like this, it was a real relief to see that last bin of fruit coming into the winery and knowing we had another great vintage behind us. Vintage this year was cooler and later than recent years. We didn't really start harvesting until April, and most of our harvesting was done in the second half of April. It was also windier and cooler very early on in the growing season, which saw significantly lower yields across most of our vineyards. Being a cooler, later ripening year, this actually really worked in our favour and helped ensure we achieved optimal ripeness, so it was really a case of quality over quantity this year. The long, slow ripening season gave us some real intensity and concentration of flavours and aromas. An early highlight for me is definitely some of the aromatic white varietals with some really lifted and expressive aromas. I think the sparklings out of this year are also very strong, and we can expect some very good things to come.
Hello, I'm Beck Duffy here up in the Tamar Valley. I'm at Home Oak Vineyards. We're located on the West Tamar, and I'm going to give you a vintage report for 2020. So 2020 was definitely a challenging vintage, and I think you'll probably hear that word quite a lot from a number of people. Challenging doesn't mean bad though. There was just a lot of things that we had to deal with all at once, which did cause us a little bit of grief at the time, but we've got some really great wines come out of 2020. So I guess the vintage started really back in late 2019 in terms of vine growth. It was quite windy, which sort of stagnated the growth of our vines a little bit. So we didn't have big canopies to start with early in the season. We had a bit of a kick-off in January of this year, and we did have a little bit of warmer weather, which was fantastic, and so we did eventually get some larger size canopies, which provided us enough leaves to ripen our fruit, because it was a really cool vintage down here. It was quite late. It was probably about 10 days later than average, but about 3 weeks probably later than the 29 vintage, which was exceptionally early. So I've been making wine here in Tasmania at Home Oak for 14 years now, and certainly no two vintages are the same, so we don't expect it to be. So we're in quite a good position to be quite flexible with what we do. But obviously right at the start of vintage, COVID-19 hit Australia, which added a whole other layer of complexity and stress for us at a time when we were also dealing with a lot of cool weather and a lot of rain as well. So that's why we sort of say challenging, but the good part of the vintage is that we came out of it really well. We did have to, I guess, just to choose the correct dates for picking. Obviously we were forced a little bit by the weather that we were given, and in some cases that would sort of change what we would do in a perfect year, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it makes a big difference to our wines. It just means that we have to think of ways to express that fruit for this given vintage. And what I'm really excited about from this vintage is our Pinot Noirs. I sort of find in the cool seasons that we're forced to probably pick earlier than what we had done in previous years, or at lower sugar levels and perhaps slightly higher acidities. And that is actually a good thing, because you get really lovely, bright, crunchy fruit, beautiful aromatics because of the cooler weather this year as well. But we've got really great tannin structure in our Pinots. So I think that there's going to be some fantastic Pinots come from this vintage. Certainly lots of intensity. Yields were slightly lower than usual. Really beautiful, elegant styles of Pinot. So I guess that's what I'm most excited about from this vintage.